compensation program, they paid the salespeople 10% of the profit. So if the company made $1,000 profit on a sale, the salesperson would get $100 and the company would get $900. I had them calculate what's the average new client is worth to them in dollars each time they buy, how many times that client will buy from them each year, and how many years the average client will be with them. In turn, out of the first sale, on average, resulted in about $200 profit for the company. Of that, $20 went to the salesman or the woman, and $180 went to the company. On average, the client bought 5 times a year for 3 years, so basically each time the company got a new client, they were receiving $3,000 in cumulative profits. My solution, instead of giving the salespeople 10% of the profit on a sale to a new first-time client, give them 100% of the profit of the first sale. The company's management response was, "You're insane." I smiled pleasantly and went on to explain that as long as their salespeople maintain sales from existing clients at past levels or above, give them 100% of the profit of the first sale for every new client they bring in. They'll be 10 times more motivated to sell new clients, and every time they bring in a new client, the salesperson makes an additional $200, but the company makes an additional $2,800. So this is employing a different way of thinking to increase the number of clients we get by incentivizing the salespeople to make them even more motivated, because that's a driving factor. So what are some other driving factors that we could use to increase the number of clients if we all want more clients? Well, we're going to get into risk reversals, referrals, selecting our target market, unique selling proposition, host-beneficiary relationships. Let's start by unique selling proposition, because I think that this is a very important element. Your unique selling proposition is that distinct, appealing idea that sets your business apart from every other Me Too competitor. If you see yourself as just an IT solution provider, chances are you're not going to be as compelling to all the prospects that the other IT companies are targeting. What you need to do is stand out. And you can stand out by crafting a unique selling proposition. Now, there are many steps and examples covered in the book, but let's go over some examples to help us understand. So Domino's Pizza, hot, juicy, delicious pizza delivered to your door in 30 minutes or less, or it's yours absolutely free. How do they differentiate themselves? They're saying hot, juicy, delicious pizza, that's going to be at your door in 30 minutes or less. And if not, we'll buy it for you. It's free to you. That's a unique selling proposition that differentiates themselves from the other providers of pizza. In the 1960s, Avis was struggling to come up with a marketing approach that would gain them the market advantage that they desired. They needed a unique selling proposition that was very powerful. After all, Hertz was head above them in size and in market share. What did they do? They came up with a USP. We're number 2, we try harder, and they demonstrated what they extended that by extending themselves by working harder and giving better rates, by being more courteous. Now, here's the thing about this. If you're number 2, they blatantly accepted that they're number 2, but they said, because we're number 2, we try harder. It's very, you can just say it's catchy, but it offers more value to the client. It's proposing that it gives more value to the client, which is more valuable. So they will try harder, and they're committing to try harder by doing all these other things. Nordstrom's built their department store success through one basic unique selling proposition. If you have any problem with a purchase for any reason, bring it back for a no questions asked, 100% money back refund anytime in the future. Anytime in the future. Not in 3 days, not in 7 days, not in 30 days. If a year later you're not satisfied, if 5 years you're dissatisfied, it's not a problem. Okay? Now think how powerful that is when you look at all the other options you have to buy clothes or whatever. You can go back at any time in the future and return that for 100% money back refund. Now, not everyone is going to do that, and based on that statistical probability and the risk that's being reduced, that increases the confidence in the buying, they're able to differentiate themselves, A, and number 2, they're able to take the market share just by thinking differently. Financial advisor Howard Ruff built a $20 million newsletter empire back in the 80s by putting himself in a unique and distinctive position in his marketplace. Most of the other financial advisors took the position that they were big-time Wall Street pros and they were trying to appeal only to the affluent investors. Howard took the opposite approach and he said, I am the financial advisor to the middle class, and I want to protect your interests at a different level. I know how hard you work to make a dollar. I know how important it is to you so that you don't lose it. I know how critical your retirement monies are to you. I respect and I approach your situation differently than anyone else. So this automatically speaks to the unique pains, desires, frustrations that the middle class are experiencing, and thus likely they're going to be more compelled to want to go with him versus the other firms that don't see them from this unique perspective, a unique selling proposition. If you improve your unique selling proposition, you increase the likelihood of increasing the number of clients. And again, going back to our example here, every year we only need to make a commitment to do this by 10% to get considerable return when we combine it with the other 2 elements of the three ways to grow your business. And you can see already that most businesses don't look at it this way. So you can see how if you apply this philosophy and this way of doing things to your business, that your likelihood of success goes up higher. So next is risk reversal. Risk reversal. So there's a concept called better than risk-free guarantee. Better than risk-free. So you've heard the basic guarantee, 30 days or your money back. If you don't like it, within 30 days you can return it back for a full refund. Well, how can you make it even more compelling that your competitors that use that? Well, how about this? The better than risk-free guarantee enables you to do something that a basic guarantee or risk reversal approach does not. When you utilize a better than risk-free guarantee, you are acknowledging and rewarding the client for the value both his or her time and faith expended in favoring you with their purchase decision. When you tell me that if I'm dissatisfied for any reason whatsoever, you'll not only give me a full immediate return of my purchase, but you promise me an additional reward on top, a compensation incentive for having taken the time and really valuing your opportunity cost, effort, and faith to purchase in the first place, I'm more impressed. I'm hard pressed to say no to a proposition like that. So it's all about adjusting our risk reversal, which is essentially the money back guarantee standard, and making it more compelling to reduce the risk. Remember, one of the things we want to do is we want to reduce the risk. We don't want to just ask people for money. We want to reduce the risk because they want to have faith that what you have to offer is going to produce the result for them. They want the result, provided you're targeting the right people. Some people might not be interested in what you have to offer. And if they're the kind that are going to buy something like that or are considering buying something like that, what's holding them on the fence usually is that they feel that there's too much at risk. So we want to look for ways to reduce that risk. Whenever two parties come together, this is the way to think about it, and always remember this. Whenever two parties come together to transact business of any kind, one side is always asking the other, consciously or otherwise, to assume more or all of the risk. If you ask someone to take on all the risk, their first inclination is not to buy. Think about this for a moment. This is even true in like dating context, in personal relationship context, as much as it's true in business context. Remember the what if. So here are some examples here. Did you ever subscribe to a magazine or a newsletter, and the reason you subscribed was because they gave you a 30, 60, or 90-day, no questions asked, 100% money back guarantee, or even not asked you to pay for it upfront? That's risk reversal. As president of Chrysler, Lee Iacocca took only $1 annual salary and stock options that would pay off only if he improved the company's bottom line. You know, when you go and work for a company, by default, what a lot of people do, and there's a lot of creative applications for this, you can apply this for your career and so forth, is they say, pay me $100,000 or pay me $1 million and I will increase your bottom line by 10 or 15%, which is going to create whatever 1 million or 10 million return. That's a guarantee. Trust me on this one. It's better than not saying anything. But what if you were so confident? What if you actually knew? And you know, this kind of stuff works if you have something good to offer. If you don't have good things to offer and you're not confident and you can't produce results, this stuff's not going to work, because then you're just trying to use it as a manipulative technique and it's going to come bite you later on because you're not going to make the money. But if you're confident as a consultant and you know that you can increase their profits at the end of the year by, let's say, $1 million just by investing 2-3 hours a day, 3-4 days a week for a whole year, you could say to them, because of your experience, you could say, look, just give me some stock option and $1 a salary. Give me only 50K. Give me only 25K, because I know I'm going to make you guys an extra whatever. And if you do your calculations right, you'll make more money by doing that. But what you're doing is you're reducing the risk. So next is referrals, right? Referrals is what helped me build my IT business. I grew my IT business to 50 plus clients in a very short time just by using referrals. Okay? I would find accountants that had access to a lot of clients. I built relationships with the accountant, and they would refer clients to me, rather than going out door to door and trying to get clients. You need to figure out who can generate referrals for you and you got to build relationships. So most people and businesses spend all their time, effort, and money on conventional marketing, advertising, or selling programs, when a fraction of that effort at virtually no expense will get them many times the results if they develop a formalized referral system. A formal client referral system will bring you an immediate increase in clients and profits, and it doesn't really cost you anything to implement. Maybe a referral fee at the most. A referral-generated client normally spends more money, buys more often, and is more profitable and loyal, and oftentimes a lot more of a pleasure to deal with, because especially in the IT world, I was really picky on the kind of clients that I took in because I didn't want a stressful client that was overly demanding and so forth. And what I found is that when I found a good pool of clients, they knew other clients or other business owners that were just like them, that were a pleasure to deal with, and I would gladly take their referrals. So referral-generated client normally spends more money, buys more often, is more profitable and loyal than most other categories of businesses that you could go after. Now, Jay has identified 93, and he sells on the Abraham website the 93 referral systems, like 93 different referral generation strategies. If you're interested in that, you can email me. Referral systems, let's look at that. Step 1, every time clients deal with you in person, through your sales staff, by letter, email, or on the phone, diplomatically ask them for client referrals. But first you must set the stage. Tell your clients that you realize and enjoy doing business with them, and they probably associate with other people like them who mirror their values and quality. Tell them you'd like to extend to them the opportunity of referring their valued and trusted associates to you. Then help the client see a clear picture of who in their lives could benefit most effectively and naturally from your products and services. Tell them what kind of person or business it might be.
Ourselves. What are the hidden psychological or emotional risks of not changing careers and staying stuck?
It's opportunity cost. We never think of that. We never think of there's a big risk of doing the same thing. A very small percentage of the things that happen to you or the decisions you make determine most of the success. And this is why I always say that 20% of your life should be deliberately...
Rory Sutherland is an expert in marketing and human behaviour. He's an author, columnist, and vice chairman of the Ogilvy Advertising Company, so he knows a lot about the psychology of winning clients, taking risks, and optimising for attention.
Don't ever assume that the fact that nobody's doing it is simply because they've tried and it has worked. No, they probably haven't even tried. A lot of larger businesses demand proof before you do anything, but there's never any proof of anything innovative because it doesn't exist yet.
If you could give someone on the edge of a career switch one behavioural economics hack, what would that be?
What, to make it easier for them to switch?
Yeah.
I'll tell this story because it's quite amusing.
Hello and welcome to The Switch from St James's Place Financial Advisor Academy. I'm G for Tips. If you're ready for a better, more fulfilling career, this is your go-to resource to start that journey. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Rory Sutherland. Rory, a very warm welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm very excited to have you in the studio with us today. Now, Rory, you have described much of your career as being shaped by luck, timing and curiosity. Looking back, what risks felt pivotal to getting where you are now?
Very interesting question, which is that we tend to think that success is only valid if we planned it in advance. In other words, we only deem successful those things we achieved which we intended to achieve. And I think that's too deterministic an approach to life, that you ought to always in life place a side bet, which is, I'm not entirely sure where this is going, but I'm currently interested, and it's a way of maximizing your chance of getting lucky. If you think about it, when you go to a party, you don't go to a party necessarily with a specific intention. You go there to see what happens. And one of the things that worries me about current large businesses is they're so keen in narrowly defining and prescribing what everybody does all the time to make the organization look efficient, that they pay a hidden cost, which is you never have any lucky accidents. And you can take this back to the field of science, by the way, which is penicillin being one obvious case, Viagra being another one. In fact, most breakthrough scientific discoveries involve a degree of luck. It wasn't what someone was planning to do all along. And so in my own case, I suppose, I was incredibly lucky in one respect, in that my brother, who's an academic, I was working in marketing in the early, I've been there for about 6 or 7 years, in the mid-1990s. My brother, who's an academic, flat shared with someone in Berkeley, California, who'd previously been the flatmate of Tim Berners-Lee. So I got to hear about the World Wide Web incredibly early. And by the way, this is always forgotten. There was a period of about a year where being an internet enthusiast made you something a little like a train spotter. You were treated as a weirdo. And by the way, the importance of it for the first year or so was widely dismissed. Or, people described it as CB radio for the 1990s and so on. But that gave me, in a way, actually, to be honest, it was a disadvantage and an advantage. In terms of my being able to understand it and talk about it fluently, it was a great advantage. I was in early. The only thing is, had I started a business at that stage, it probably would have been too early. It's worth noting, I think, that, for example, timing is extraordinarily important in the creation of any business. Someone made the point, I think, very astutely, that if Bill Gates, for example, or Jobs, or any of those people, Andy Grove, if they'd been born 3 years earlier or 3 years later, they couldn't have done what they did. Very interesting. I think Walmart, let me get this right, Walmart, Kmart, and Target were all founded in the same year, I think 1962. And we mustn't forget this, by the way, when we're both praising people who are successful in business or sometimes disparaging people who fail, some part of it is beyond your control because it's simply getting the moment right. And I think there are two words we should rehabilitate, which is opportunistic and anecdotal. Because really interesting information generally emerges first in anecdotal form. It's not as a consequence of detailed data analysis or something. It's that someone notices something strange and decides to see what it means.
Absolutely.
And to a very large extent, I think it's intuitive as well. I think small businesses work intuitively. It's in larger businesses you need to pretend to be rational all the time because you spend half your life justifying yourself to somebody else. And I'm guessing among your viewers here, one of the reasons why they decided to go it alone is because they got sick of working in a corporate environment where only about 20 to 30% of what you do is actually valuable or revenue generating, and the other 70% is some kind of arse covering. and actually, also the nature of corporate bureaucracies. I totally sympathise with anybody. It's got worse, I think significantly worse in the last 15 to 20 years, where there has to be a process or a procedure for everything that you do. And so the exercise of subjective judgment, which has always been and should remain a large part of business decision making, when you don't have all the data you need to make a decision, to some extent it's got to involve a degree of intuition. And yet business is so frightened of having any decision questioned or challenged that they construct these kind of artificial, rational processes, which are really all about blame avoidance. They're nothing to do with value creation at all. So anybody who wants to get out of that kind of world where actually the private sector increasingly looks like the public sector, you've got my support. I completely understand your motivation.
Fantastic. Now, you woke up one day and said, I woke up a celebrity one day. So is there a path that led you to there that others might be able to follow? Or can you optimise those lucky accidents that you mentioned?
Well, that was lucky, in the sense that it wasn't me who thought I'd go on TikTok. It was never my intention to be on TikTok. And actually, it was partly a byproduct of the pandemic, because during the pandemic, I just appeared on podcasts, because why not? I mean, there wasn't much else I could be doing. And also because the podcasts were online, it was a pretty convenient thing to do. And then a couple of people, one person in particular, just started following me fairly assiduously, and then they started taking clips from my podcasts and effectively TikTokizing them. And so they'd take an interesting 30 seconds or 45 seconds, they'd add captions, and they just started posting those. And the first I knew about it really was, I think one was my children going, Dad, what the hell are you doing on TikTok? And the second thing was I'd occasionally get mobbed by school kids on the street. And so that was one of those cases where simple fame and exposure has a value all in itself. And I think in the advertising industry, we've slightly lost sight of this because it sounds very banal. If you go to an advertising agency, we're expected to say something really sophisticated now, like, we need to optimize your micro-targeting of, smaller level demographics. Okay, that's kind of what makes you look intelligent and adult. And the simple promise, we can make you famous, looks a bit childish and banal. But actually, fame is very, very valuable in lots and lots of complementary ways. Not least, opportunities come to you rather than you needing to find them all for yourself.
And how much of risk-taking is about reframing, so changing the way you see risk rather than the risk itself?
First of all, I think there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. And often, even when the position may be fairly positive overall, we're disquieted by the idea of uncertainty. That's one of the reasons why people find it very difficult to leave a full-time paid job, because the money isn't great, the prospects are rubbish. Broadly speaking, employers have been treating employees worse and worse over the 30 years of my working life. There was always an implicit understanding in the first 20 years of my working life that if the business did well, the employees did well. It was never formally recorded, but that was the understanding. And I think that contract's been broken. I think if the company does well, the shareholders do well, and the employees get to keep their jobs. I think it's a fundamentally different kind of engagement. And what I noticed is, of course, my younger staff don't realise that it was ever any different. And so, but nonetheless, it offers the appeal of a paycheck at the end of the month. And so even when, in every statistical question, it makes sense to go it alone, our natural instinct for variance reduction or risk aversion makes it scary. There are some elements of legislation which I think need to be looked at, because ultimately, I think the future of the economy really no longer depends on large businesses to the extent that it once did. I think the future of a wealthy economy depends really on two things, which is high-quality jobs for frontline service staff and independent entrepreneurs and smaller businesses.
And in something you said earlier, do you feel that humans often overestimate certain risks, like career change or failure, and underestimate other risks, like staying stuck in the wrong job?
Yes, there's a very simple way to explain this, which is a cost, i.e. the loss of a salary, is quantifiable and concrete. An opportunity cost is nebulous. And this is why I always say that 20% of your life should be deliberately a bit randomized. And I occasionally, with my own employer, I would run into problems with this, which is they go, why are you going to this conference? And I'd say, I don't know yet because I haven't been. And my argument is that to some extent, a proportion of your resources should be devoted to exploratory activities. And the reason is it's very, very easy to focus purely on the day job, what we need to do now, because it makes you feel very efficient. And as I said, a loss is completely tangible and quantifiable. And I would argue that the power of finance functions in modern business is problematic because they're uncertainty averse. In other words, a finance person would rather make a definite 3% than take a slightly riskier decision where the expected outcome might be 8%, but there was a chance of a 1% downside. And so the way to understand this probably best is a book. It sounds very odd that I'm recommending to serious financial advisors a book written by a poker player. But Annie Duke, who was for some years a professional poker player, has written a book called Thinking in Bets. And it's a very, very useful mindset to adopt. It's also, by the way, a very important mindset to adopt as an investor as well. So this applies both to your own personal life, but also to how you approach investment. That it is very important to avoid bankruptcy. So let's not be totally foolish here. If you have some sort of cushion on which you can depend, it makes sense to be much riskier elsewhere. Because, in other words, your downside is not elimination, bankruptcy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we probably have, and you can understand why our brains evolved this way, because 2 or 3 bad decisions could lead to starvation. Sticking with what or experimenting with a new food could lead to poisoning. So we've evolved, in a sense, to be both habit-driven and risk-averse. And also we've evolved, by the way, to be a herd species as well. We copy other people to a disproportionate extent. And going out on your own when all your friends are in a full-time job feels disproportionately scary. But I always make the point that, to an extent, you do tend to find entrepreneurs in poker clubs or casinos rather than in chess clubs.
Absolutely.
Because they accept the fact that actually, to some extent, life is fat-tailed, if I'm being honest about it, which is to say that a very small percentage of the things that happen to you or the decisions you make determine most of the success or most of the outcome. And fluke events like me being on TikTok, it was never really planned, it was never really intended. But the way to look at it is, when you look back on your life, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things you did and 5 things that happened to you were almost more important than everything else put together. All the decisions about what shoes to wear, where to go on holiday, often end up being relatively trivial compared to a few fluke events. And actually, if you play poker, or if you play blackjack, they will notice the same thing, that actually you go home and 5 or 6 hands really determine the outcome for the whole evening.
Amazing.
And I think real life is like that, and we spend a lot of time pretending it isn't.
Yeah, and you mentioned exploratory activities. Our audience are people considering a career change for one reason or another, not necessarily made the decision to join St James's Place, although we hope some of them will make that decision. But what kind of activities might somebody who's already thinking if they want something different and something new, what kind of exploratory activities could they start to do?
Talk to other people in the field, because they will also describe to you the emotions they experienced when they first took the plunge. What you also notice is that, except under duress, let's also look at observation. Okay, let's just look at behavioural observation to cheer yourself up and to give yourself confidence. I always argue, look, we can have huge arguments about electric cars, whether they're better, whether they're worse, whether there should be a subsidy. The real question to ask is how many people who buy an electric car go back to a petrol car? And it's only about 7 or 8%. Same is true of automatic transmission. And one thing, people go, oh, no, I don't want an automatic, I miss the sense of control. Once people have an automatic car, they never got a manual car ever again.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of decisions that are like this, which are difficult to take. But once you've taken them, you never go back. And I think simple observation teaches you that people who've gone freelance, people who've gone independent, people who've discovered autonomy, generally you don't find them going, I really miss the 9 to 5, do you?
Absolutely.
Let's be honest about this. There might be 1 or 2. They might miss the paycheck. They might miss the regularity of the paycheck. There may be a whole load of bureaucratic and administrative things that were once taken care of that now they have to do themselves. And by the way, that burden's getting worse to a point that really worries me. There are several things that worry me about self-employment. One is high housing costs. What we've got to remember, Silicon Valley was founded in California partly because at the time property was really cheap there. That's one thing that an entrepreneur needs to minimize the number of external commitments you have. And the growth in bureaucracy also worries me. Nonetheless, when you account for everything else, there aren't many people who go, I'd go back if I could.
They always say, I wish I did it sooner.
I wish I'd done it sooner. And I think that's a piece of behavioural evidence. Now, okay, there's probably a degree of self-justification in that people minimise regret, and people tend not to talk about their regrets. But nonetheless, the preponderance of that, why didn't I do that 5 years earlier? There's also an additional economic factor to consider here. And in the world of financial advice, I've often said that Zoom and YouTube may be the most important technologies for financial advisors in the last 50 years. And the reason is that several things. One, a lot of your clientele want to have a conversation with you. They need a human being. I needed a human being to talk to me to pay off my mortgage. It was too big a decision for me to take without coaching. And to some extent, you're a financial therapist, not a financial advisor in that job. In the same way that hairdressers are therapists who also cut your hair.
Yeah.
There's a very large emotional support role in that job. I need a human being. But I don't necessarily want them to come to my house. I've got to get home early, I've got to tidy the house, I've got to buy biscuits, make coffee, make small talk, explain where the entrance is. And the Zoom call, particularly with maybe both parties present, is an absolute kind of 10x breakthrough in this business. So that's one way in which it's really, really important. Also, YouTube, you're now your own television producer if you want to be. So the YouTube channel could be exclusive just to your clientele, but you can now spend an hour talking to 100 people rather than an hour talking to 1. So those 2 technologies, which in a field which still requires the presence of a human being, it can't be automated, and yet which fundamentally makes the whole thing vastly more efficient. That's important. But there's a third thing, which is, what if you could live somewhere else? Because I argue increasingly that if we talk about the rich moving to low tax jurisdictions, probably the best financial move you might be able to make in life is to move to a low rent jurisdiction or a low property price jurisdiction. Because then you can put less of your own money into the property market, which is a hopelessly illiquid and I would argue increasingly dangerous place to rely on capital accumulation. Buy to let without capital accumulation, I think it's a mug's game, by the way, in terms of the return you get. And so if this technology gives you the freedom to live somewhere less expensive to live, that's much more tax efficient than getting a pay rise, and it's quite often more valuable. Don't necessarily, one bit of advice, you always get the people who overcompensate and move to the Outer Hebrides. Actually, you don't need to do that. There's comparatively inexpensive and very desirable property within sort of 60 or 70 miles of London, sometimes less. But the extent to which the problem that far too much of Britain's disposable income is going in, if you ever want to feel like a missionary as a financial advisor, just see your mission as this. My job is to get more and more of people's available capital going into the productive economy rather than going into the property market. Your other mission is to get young people to understand the compounding effect. Because I didn't. When I was younger, I had this pension. I'm slightly resentful. I thought I could have gone on holiday with that money. It's not doing anything. Suddenly, I'm 58. I suddenly have this, where did all this money come from? We don't instinctively understand the compounding effect. We think that things grow linearly. And so, you have the interesting psychological challenge, and this is why behavioural science, I think, is so important in your business, of selling something that's unappealing at first, where the real rewards only become apparent much later. You will have a lot of people in 15 years' time or 20 years' time who absolutely love you if you're doing your job right. colleague of mine met someone in a pub who'd worked for him 20 years earlier. And the colleague said to a very deeply unemotional guy, he said, "Don't forget, it was me who persuaded you to take out a pension." He wasn't a financial advisor, he was just a colleague. And when the company instituted a kind of
employee contribution
scheme, my friend persuaded his colleague to go into it. And when he reminded him of this fact at the pub, the guy hugged him. As I said, he was not a demonstrative or emotional man by any means. But it's transformed his life now. He would be guessing he's probably 61 now. And it's given him options that he never knew he'd have.
Yeah.
Far, far better than living in an expensive house, because you actually have money in a liquid form that you can access part of it without having to move house.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's go back to our career changes. You've spoken a lot about thinking about the risks from a financial perspective. But what are the hidden psychological or emotional risks of not changing careers and staying stuck, not taking the leap?
It's opportunity cost. That's a very, very good reframing, by the way, which is we never think of that. We never think of there's a big risk to doing the same thing. There's a big risk to continuing doing what I'm doing.
Or saving in the bank account.
Because we automatically are, we've evolved to think of habitual behaviours as safe. Job security isn't what it was. That's one point. Optionality, by the way, has a value all of its own. The fact that you can deploy your time in a way of your own choosing has a double payback. It helps you make more money, but it also makes you happier in and of itself. So that's a double win, for example. Neither of those things is really available to you if you're in paid full-time employment.
So interesting.
Now, by the way, what I don't want to be doing here is saying to someone who's 23 and has only had 1 year's experience in the workforce, off you go and do your own thing. I think that gaining 3, 4, 5 years experience minimum in that kind of conventional work setting has all kinds of value to it. You learn a lot at someone else's expense, to a large extent. To some extent, you're insured against mistakes. And also, I think you learn things like self-discipline, punctuality. I always said, if I'd just gone self-employed after being a student, I probably wouldn't have started work till Wednesday every week, if I'm being honest about it. So Jimmy Carr always refers to this, that he worked for Shell. He worked in ad agency, actually, and then worked for Shell. And his work ethic is extraordinary. And he says, well, everybody says my work ethic is extraordinary. Maybe it is for a comedian, but it was just what I learned to do when I was in office. You put in 8 or 9 hours a day for 5 days a week minimum.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I mean, one, you're tied to a particular place, you're tied to a particular time. Let's say your children have left home. One of the joyous things about that is you can suddenly take holidays at less crowded, less expensive times of the year. The sheer flexibility of it is really valuable. Now, I'm going to advise, obviously, you should take out insurance against certain things, because there are things that your employer sort of invisibly took care of that you may want to be quite alert to once you go self-employed. You will also find, by the way, the other bit of tip would be probably go and open a load of bank accounts and take out any mortgages you want, or do anything bureaucratic before you leave work. Because it is much easier to do those things when you're in full-time employment.
Absolutely. We've got a full financial due diligence onboarding process with people,
Perfect.
and we make sure that we have these very meaningful conversations with not just the person considering joining us, but considering the whole household, what their future plans are, what does the household income look like, and taking that risk and making sure it is an acceptable financial risk for them. But the risk of not doing it is missing out on personal growth, all the autonomy, and all the things that we've spoken about.
By the way, I imagine what you're seeing is that you're in a business which 10 years ago was overwhelmingly male, wasn't it? I don't know why, by the way. There's no particular
there's no
reason.
reason why.
I mean, unless it's total prejudice, that no, it's numbers, so it has to be a chap.
I think it's a hangover to that.
It probably is a hangover from. Funny enough, I was reading a book this morning where they said that a large part of the distrust of intuition, which is an incredibly valuable mental skill, which if you become an entrepreneur, you will increasingly use, comes from an old sexist idea in psychology in the 19th century that men were rational and women were intuitive. And so intuition was considered the less reliable. And so in some ways, the undervaluing of intuition arose from a form of 19th century sexism. But I mean, interesting question there in terms of, this would have been a field that was overwhelmingly male. And actually, I think the field needs to feminize inverted commas, in both metaphorically and literally, for a very interesting reason, which is that when I said earlier that you're a financial therapist, I think conversations about money purely as money are boring, whereas conversations about what you want out of life are fundamentally interesting. And by the way, it's weird how little time people actually spend asking, what do I really want to do? The day-to-day, firefighting, the urgent, always triumphs over the really important. There's a story always told it's often used in sermons, I think, in a religious setting, which is you can get far more things in a jar if you put the big stones in first
Yes,
and then put the sand in
metaphor,
second.
yeah.
If you put the sand in first, you can't get the
Can't
stones
put all the big ones in.
And the analogy, the metaphor they're using there is that deal with the big stuff first, and then the little stuff will take care of itself. But most of the time, the little stuff, and by the way, in a digital world, this is even worse, okay? With beeping phones, in other words, we're always on, our facility for concentration and our facility for switching off has been badly dented. The little stuff, the little shiny things distract us from what's really important. And, one question to ask, which, if you're thinking of going independent, is do you have some massive hobby or enthusiasm or passion that you would like to combine with a job? Because you've previously seen your life as being work, leisure. You're now entering a world where the two are not mutually exclusive. I spent, 10 days, I suppose about 8 days in Tenerife about 2 weeks ago. For about 3 days of it, I was working. Daniel Kahneman, you may be familiar with Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman even argues that when you go on holiday, you should work for a couple of days in the middle, because he said you get acclimatized to constant leisure, so it loses its novelty value. So if you loll around by the pool for 2 days and then do a day's work, going back to the pool now feels more enjoyable. So he argues you can actually maximize enjoyment by breaking it up slightly. So there are things you can suddenly do which you never thought of doing because you thought of them as mutually exclusive, but in fact they're combinatorial. And I'm pretty happy. You get up in the morning, you do a morning's work, you've got the afternoon to yourself on holiday. That's actually a fantastic combination.
Yeah.
Now, the conventional world of work never allowed for that degree of ambiguity.
No, absolutely. Now, I've got one final question on risk. What is the biggest risk that you have taken that didn't work out, and what did it teach you?
First of all, there's a risk I didn't take, which I wish I had, which was a very, very large pitch, where the person effectively asking us to pitch as an agency was mad, but the amount of money was available was very large. And I wish to this day we just walked away. But it was kind of like one of those biased decisions where everybody, if you walked away, everybody would have, it's a FOMO problem, really. And I wished for ages after that, I wished I'd just done the brave thing and walked away. In terms of risks I've taken, well, first of all, tough question, because you can reframe certain failures as a learning experience, and certain things where your original intention fails prove valuable in some other way. What have I been? I'll tell you a lovely mistake I made, which is that somebody came to me about 10 years ago with this idea to popularise a fermented tea drink, which sounded to me the most ridiculous idea I'd ever heard in my life, and it turned out it was called kombucha. So it's always worth remembering, with the best will in the world, the best you can hope for is to be right about more things than you're wrong about. Don't let you beat yourself up over mistakes you make, because it's the old phrase: if you never miss a plane, if you've never ever missed a flight, you spent too much of your life at airports. And likewise, if you've never made a mistake, you've almost certainly been far too cautious in terms of what you do.
Now, we're going to move on to winning clients and behavioural science.
Yep.
Now, when it comes to gaining trust, when you're new to something, like our new advisors coming in to our academy program, what psychological tactics can help them to build trust quickly with clients?
One thing, read Robert Cialdini in his book on influence. I don't know to what part their training is to do with this. One part is underselling people, is saying what you don't need. At your stage of life, I wouldn't bother with this, I wouldn't bother with this, I wouldn't bother with this. But if there's one thing I would do, it's this. Secondly, be long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. Because fundamentally, there are two forms of capitalism. There's transactional capitalism and there's relational capitalism. And you're in the relational capitalism business, which is your job is to maximize the value of a relationship to mutual benefit over time, not to get the biggest hit you can from a short-term transaction. Other things that contribute to trust, acts of discretionary kindness or generosity generally do that. There are simple courtesy, empathy. Lots of those things contribute to trust. It's also worth asking the opposite question: what are the behaviours which make you profoundly untrustworthy? Because the first job is to eradicate any of those. And maybe you are deeply untrustworthy, in which case you won't last very long in this business, I suspect, because it's quite difficult to hide. Human instinct is pretty good. The other thing is to change the conversation from one about wealth maximisation to one about lifestyle. And give advice on subjects where you have no dog in the fight. I mean, one very interesting thing about going self-employed, by the way, which no one ever tells you in advance, is that the tax position completely changes your approach to spending. Because, of course, you're taxed when you take money out of the business, but you're not taxed when you reinvest in the business. There are a few people who desperately want to bring back the enterprise allowance scheme, because what they realise on the enterprise allowance scheme is that when people create a business, they fundamentally think the very existence of a business in their name makes them think differently. The other thing is that it is actually much more tax efficient in many ways. You don't get an electric car because you'll get absolutely minuscule benefit in kind tax from you can do it with salary sacrifice in some jobs, but there are significant tax advantages because certain things which you always had to pay for out of taxed income are now available to you out of untaxed income.
Absolutely.
But when I say talk to people about wider financial advice, don't go straight to the sell, because an awful lot of the value you add to these people, by the way, I think this is true, that even if the financial advisors I dealt with over the last 35 years, even if the return had been dismal, I would still be grateful to them, because, to be absolutely honest, without them, I would have spent the money rather than saving it. And so, at the very least, what you do is you help people think further ahead than the traditional week or day or whatever it may be. And one of the great questions is, one way to be trustworthy is people, I don't want to get wildly philosophical and into Simon Sinek territory here, but people can kind of tell why you're doing it. And if you can build a sense of mission and purpose into what you're doing, rather than narrow short-term financial self-interest, it shows. So I would say that just as, in evolutionary terms, okay, the objective of romance is probably sexual, right? What evolutionary psychologists would call that is one objective is the ultimate objective, the other one is the proximate objective. And understand that distinction between the proximate and the ultimate objective, which is that in many ways in your business, profitability is best pursued obliquely. If you help people do something, and then profit and commission and all the other rewards are a byproduct of that thing, ironically, you end up making more money than if you pursue money directly. And John Kay has written a book about this called Obliquity. He's a London Business School professor and journalist. And the book's called Obliquity. And there are certain things, by which I mean is that you'll probably be more likely to have children in an evolutionary sense if you pursue being romantic than if you pursue procreation directly. Oh, another very important thing in trust is tell people bad news, I would argue.
Okay.
A degree of candour, a degree of self-awareness, a degree of self-confession. Someone put it to me very brilliantly, and they were to do their job as advising CEOs. And they said it's something very, very few CEOs do, because they think my job is to look perfect. But they actually said a rather beautiful phrase. They said an admission of weakness is sometimes the ultimate power move, because the fact that you can afford to do it speaks volumes. Those people who are always pretending that everything's perfect, fundamentally we're suspicious of them, because we suspect that we're not getting the real them. They're issuing bulletins about themselves or press releases about themselves, rather than genuinely allowing us to look inside them a little bit.
Absolutely. And what about tactics beyond our field? Other new business owners, wooing potential clients outside of the financial advice sector?
Don't afraid to be a bit eccentric. I've literally asked the question, and I don't know the answer to this question, but it deserves some research. When bankers go on television, they think their audience is other bankers, and they always wear a suit and tie. I've always argued, if ever you're a banker being interviewed on television, okay, or anybody in the field of finance being interviewed on television, you will be an inordinate, now not just you going in jeans and a hoodie, okay, but I suspect you'll be inordinately more trustworthy if you don't adopt that old uniform, because I think the suit and tie is a kind of proxy measure for probity and reliability and respectability. To be honest, I don't think it's there anymore. So, there are really important questions about how you present yourself, how you think of your personal brand. So a reasonable degree of eccentricity comes across as authenticity, that you are your own person, you're not some sort of droid, and you will ultimately find your own, being true to yourself. your own personality,
Absolutely.
okay, is a pretty good way of being trustworthy, because we're pretty good. We've had, 500,000 years of evolutionary experience in detecting people who are faking it.
Really interesting. Now, let's go back to careers, not just financial advice. We're talking all sectors now. What lessons can we take from the world of marketing to market ourselves and our careers? Should everyone adopt an online persona and think about building their own personal brand?
Yes, to an extent. And what I mean by that is be different in some way. I mean, I partly chose my financial advisor, and it sounds ridiculous, because they had a really good Zoom setup. And they'd really nerded out buying an SLR camera and using it as a webcam. I thought, well, that's how I want to interact with my advisor. Therefore, I want someone who's invested in this and committed to doing it well. And it was just a general mark of professionalism. I thought that they were prepared to, speculate to accumulate, as it were. One of the most valuable attributes of a brand is simply distinctiveness. That you think of that. I mean, we were pitching to an online bank. I think we're pitching actually tomorrow or something. And they've got a very good interest rate and everything else. And I said, you're going to hate me telling you this, but you need to make the card coral. Or you need to do something slightly weird, that's talkable, that's memorable, that's out of the ordinary. Let me tell a story. There's a guy called Will Gadara, and I recommend everybody who's listening to this podcast buys his book. Which seems strange, because Will Gadara is not a financial advisor, he's a restaurateur. And he took over the restaurant 11 Madison Park in Manhattan, and turned it from the number 50 restaurant, the Perrier Awards, San Pellegrino Awards, sorry, to the number 1 restaurant. And one of the ways he did it is he took his staff, when they were number 50 in 2011, when they were number 50, he took his staff and his team to the number 1 restaurant. And they all started copying what everybody else did well. We ought to do that with the napkins. We could do that in the bathrooms. We did it. At the end of the meal, he said, I'm not interested in anything you've said so far, because you've been talking about what they're doing well, and you've been suggesting copying it. Now, if we do that, nobody will notice all that much, because someone else is doing it somewhere else. What I want to know is what was bad about the experience, what was just slightly disappointing. And then I'm going to take those 2 disappointing things, I'm going to double down. And the 2 things that were disappointing about what was then the best restaurant in the world were the coffee, and the people in the party who wanted to drink beer got treated relatively shabbily compared to the wine drinkers. Each now, 3-star restaurant, you can get the whole thing. And so he went back and he appointed one of his staff the coffee sommelier and another of his staff the beer sommelier. And in future, the coffee was single origin roasts, and there was probably a little bit of card that told you about the coffee you were drinking. And when you asked for beer, someone came along with a whole craft ale menu with tasting notes and pairing suggestions. And so
Yeah.
Now, if you're a beer drinker at that restaurant, that would blow you out of the park. Find something that nobody else does and do it really well. And I literally mean that. I mean, literally find some shtick. Now, we were discussing it, and I was having a conversation with a hotelier the other day. Now, this requires some imagination, because copying what people are already doing is very easy to do. You go, we'll do that, okay? And it's already established, there's probably a business case for it already. Doing something entirely original requires imagination, or it requires what-if questions. And talking to a hotelier, I said, the weird thing? I spend more time in hotels working than I do watching TV while I'm awake. No hotel has ever offered, even for money, to supply with a monitor. Now, the funny thing about that is it's actually a source of revenue to the hotel. You can only take so many nights hire. And that would be a deal breaker in terms of, do I stay at the X or the Y hotel? If the X hotel offers monitors and the Y hotel doesn't, for me that's a deal breaker. Okay, it'd be a bit like, it's like Wi-Fi was, about 10 years ago, I guess, no, a bit longer than that, 20 years ago in the hotel industry, Wi-Fi just became a deal breaker. If you didn't have Wi-Fi, no one would stay there. But looking for something which nobody's doing, don't ever assume that the fact that nobody's doing it is simply because they've tried and it hasn't worked. No, they probably haven't even tried. Because a lot of business is very self-referential. Also, a lot of larger businesses demand proof before you do anything. But there's never any proof of anything innovative because it doesn't exist yet.
It's so true.
And so that finance kind of burden of proof of, can you show me the business case? Can you tell me who else has done this? Which is still down from consultancy, stock and trade. We've done this over here, now we'll do it for you. Okay. Fundamentally leads you to unimaginative places, which are full of incremental improvement.
Now, we often crave data and evidence before making big life decisions, which we're increasingly getting from AI, chatbots. Is this doing us a disservice, taking away some of our spontaneity that we use in decision making?
Yes. And Jeff Bezos has, to some extent, uncovered the reason why, which is because we're more blame-averse than we are loss-averse. We're desperate to prove that every decision we made was completely robust, because in the event that it doesn't turn out well, we will be a repository of blame if our argumentation isn't completely sound. But Jeff, whose approach to decision science, Jeff Bezos, whose approach to decision sciences is very distinct and very interesting and very intelligent, argues that there are 2 kinds of decision. There are 2-way doors and there are 1-way doors. Now, a 1-way door is something irreversible. By the way, your decision to leave paid employment and and work for yourself may not be as irreversible as you think it is, because in many cases your employer would probably have you back, possibly on more generous terms than you're on at present. Okay, so first of all, it's important to be clear: if you're Amazon and you're building a 10 million square foot warehouse north of Memphis, okay, that's a pretty irreversible decision. I suppose you can sell it to somebody else, but you need to make absolutely sure your ducks are in a row, that it's the right place, that it works, that there are no major obstacles. That's a case for major due diligence and extreme rigor. Jeff argues that we make the mistake of applying the same rigor to 2-way door decisions, where we should be happy with a much lower burden of proof. Which is, a 2-way decision is one where if you walk through the door and you don't like what you see, you can dial it back. It's reversible. Okay, so marriage mostly is a 1-way door. Okay, going out to dinner with someone is a 2-way door. Okay, in other words, it's the difference between an option and a commitment. And we don't really distinguish in a business setting between the rigor we apply to both. But Jeff would argue that, look, there's an opportunity cost to not trying things. If it's almost less expensive to try the thing in reality than it is to argue about it in theory, why don't we just try it? If we don't like what we see, it hasn't cost us very much because we can kill it off quickly. Now, interestingly, both Amazon Prime and Amazon Web Services, 2 of Amazon's biggest ideas, were initially rejected by almost everybody. In fact, board members threatened to resign over Amazon Prime. The person who put the presentation together proposing that Amazon become a cloud provider apparently didn't do a very rigorous job. And loads of people were saying, no, you haven't convinced me. And Jeff stepped in and said, this is a 2-way door. We're Amazon. We'll have to spend a load of money on data centers and bandwidth and processing capacity. If we can sell that to someone else, whoop-de-doo, let's do it. And if it turns out we can't, well, we haven't lost much anyway, because we were investing most of this money anyway. And Jeff, by spotting it as a two-way door, said, I agree that the case is not completely compelling and it would turn us into a business that had to sell to very large corporations, which is where our expertise doesn't necessarily currently lie. But nonetheless, he said it's a two-way door. We'll try it. Now it's now actually the most lucrative, most profitable part of Amazon. And so understanding that, I think that what tends to happen in a business setting is we often show off by how rigorous we are. What it really is arse covering disguised as commitment or rigor. And, Gerd Gigerenzer, one of the world's best psychologists, makes this point that the natural tendency in many settings is not to make a good decision, it's make the decision that's easiest to defend. He calls it defensive decision making. And he argues that in everything from medicine to business, in many cases, people are making decisions not for the purposes of value creation, but for the purposes of blame risk minimization. Or in some cases, blame risk dispersion, because if you make a decision as a committee, there's no one person who can take the blame. So that's why so many meetings are called in business, because effectively, if we all decide collectively, effectively we've dissipated any potential blame.
Now, thinking of our career switches out there, if you could give someone on the edge of a career switch one behavioural economics hack, something they can implement today, what would that be?
What, to make it easier for them to switch?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm going to be responsible. Make sure it's the right thing to do. Make sure you have a certain amount of money in hand that, it's not going to lead to catastrophe. Discuss it with your significant others, patently. Worth noting that the dual income household, if you are in a relationship, makes this arguably the perfect household is where one person has a paid job and the other one has variable income. That is what Nassim would call a barbell strategy, which is the one income keeps the wolf from the door. It means you're going to be okay, you pay the mortgage. The second person can then afford to be more speculative. And then, you have the benefit of their potential limitless upside. Because one of the problems about working for a single employer is there's a limit how much money you can make, effectively. Because everything you get is from them. The great thing about working for multiple people is no one cares how much money you're making from anybody else. So, there are huge upsides to being plural, if you like. In other words, from not allowing your employer to have a monopoly relationship over you. So, look at it very broadly. Look at it in terms of what you want to do. Look at it in terms of saying, which might be, by the way, something I very, very largely try and get the government to encourage. Maybe the deal here is I have a better time in my 40s, 50s, 60s, but I retire a bit later. Look at the benefits of flexibility, which is, I would genuinely argue from a philosophical point of view, this is why I'm going plural at the age of 59. People have this absolute social norm, which is you bust a gut, okay? And then you retire, and you're working towards retirement. Now, the second you're working towards retirement, in other words, your day-to-day job is not providing you with enough intrinsic pleasure that you have to think about your retirement in order to actually keep going. There's something wrong. Because, if you leave that too late, for example, you end up replacing business meetings with medical appointments without an intervening, enjoyable period in between. Be careful about that. And by the way, other things, I know you're financial advisors, but I make this point. Other things other than money have a value, it's just not quantifiable. So what's the value of autonomy? What's the value of being able to go shopping on Wednesday rather than going shopping on Saturday? What's the value of being able to live where you want to live rather than living where your employer wants you to live? Now, when you add all those things together, there isn't a cash value attached to any of those things. Just because you can't put it in a spreadsheet doesn't mean it's not important.
I really love that, Rory. Thank you.
By the way, you can also save a lot of money if you've got a bit more discretionary time. Maybe instead of employing someone to put up shelves, you do it yourself. There are an awful lot of things now where I would argue that your best financial strategy to some extent is avoiding living in a high-rent area. Or even better, selling your house. I'm not sure the property market isn't going to be either very depressing for a long time or suffer some sort of dramatic correction. And this may be a great time to actually sell up and clear out. Oh, and the other one is always invert. Okay, so one final bit of advice. Right. I'll tell this story because it's quite amusing. So a couple who are friends of a friend of mine, they're both teachers. They didn't have huge salaries, but when they'd met in the early 80s, both of them had bought a flat. They sold their flats, pooled the money, bought a house in somewhere like Acton. Their discussion was they were now about 58. He was from Norfolk, she was from London. What he wanted to do was sell the house in Acton for a seven-figure sum, move back to Norfolk, and buy a really, really nice house for kind of 450,000. They could still teach part-time a bit if they wanted to. They could travel the world. They could do all manner of wonderful things. Right? She was from London and couldn't face the idea of moving out of London. Now, I can't advise them. But what I can do is borrow from Warren Buffett and say, always invert. Consider the opposite. And my only question was, can you imagine someone living in Norfolk in a £500,000 house? And they win £1 million on the lottery and they go, that's brilliant, we can move to a smaller house in Acton and work for the next 5 years. No, nobody's going to do that, right? So if the inverse of what you're doing is ridiculous, that might help you make the decision. Now, there's risk entailed, but the other point I'd make is that the boring route to riches, which is nose to the grindstone, keep going, do what you're supposed to do, stick with your employer, stay loyal, they'll look after you. That boring route to riches aided by property price appreciation, I don't think exists anymore, actually. Now, Scott Galloway, who I recommend you follow, along with some of the other interesting people on YouTube. I mentioned, obviously, earlier, I mentioned Gerd Gigerenzer, I mentioned John Kay's book of Liberty. Scott Galloway says, no, if you can get one of those great corporate jobs, in a way, do it because it's guaranteed upper middle class, reasonable prosperity. I think that is absolutely brilliant advice if you're speaking to someone in 1987. Get a job in Goldman Sachs, go and work for a large multinational corporation. I think multinational corporations no longer deliver on that promise, really.
The world's a different place.
They're a fundamentally different place, yeah.
So finally, what's the best piece of advice that you've been given, either in work or in life, that has stuck with you?
Probably, and funnily enough, it was first given to me by someone who was a friend of mine when I was at university, who was a mature student, who organised the Isle of Wight festivals, and he was a big believer in when everyone... Now, it later became the slogan of the BBH advertising agency, and everybody thought they invented it, actually. It's been around for a few years. When everybody else is eggs, Zach, that look to an extent, we're automatically a herd species. The really big gains will never come effectively pursuing the same metrics of success as everybody else. And sit down as an individual and define for yourself what success looks like. Because if you're not careful, you'll end up effectively judging success by direct comparison with other people. And I think this, if you want this to go back further than when everybody else zigzags, I think this comes from the philosopher Montaigne, which is your own happiness is too important to be outsourced to someone else's value system. And so I think it is really, really important you make the time to actually say, this is what success looks like to a lot of people. Left to my own devices, I will simply copy that. And I will judge myself by direct and easy comparison with the people I was at school with, the people I was at university with, whatever it may be. what you're doing then is you're outsourcing your own sources of happiness to someone else. I think making the space to say what really matters, which I haven't done, and nearly enough until very, very recently. But what parts of your job do you like and would you do for free, and what parts of your job do you find fundamentally painful? It's very, very easy to allow the urgent to derail the important.
Great advice, thank you. And that mirrors what a lot of people have come on the show and said, is take the time out, understand who you are, what your values are.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that's great advice. Thank you, Rory. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for coming.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Anytime.
A big thanks to Rory for joining us on the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of The Switch, make sure to follow, rate and share it with somebody who's ready for a career change. And if you're on your own journey, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more inspiration and insights coming your way. I'm G Fitted, and you've been listening to The Switch from St James's Place Financial Advisor Academy.
Stop taking life so seriously. No one is getting out of this game alive, and in 3 generations, no one will even remember your name. And if that doesn't give you liberation to just drop your problems for a moment and find some joy, I don't know what will. Because there'll never be a time when there's no problems in life. And that's why this time between Christmas and New Year is a really wonderful time to plan big dreams and goals for the year.
So let's talk about that.
Chris Williamson is one of the world's leading podcast hosts and thinkers, and now he's back.
Educating us on how to build discipline, turning goals into results, what's stopping us finding love,
And what makes a good man in today's society?
The single best question to work out what you should be doing next year. What would have to happen by the end of 2026 for me to look back and consider it a success? And it usually comes down to only a few things. The first one is, to pick something up, you have to put something down. So setting the bar unrealistically high does not increase your performance. Like, you probably lose 20 pounds and get a boyfriend. You can't do that and move cities and start a new business, so make the assumption. I can do no more than I'm doing now. Second, if your life was a movie and the audience were watching, what would they be screaming and telling you to do in your life? It is obvious. Leave the relationship. If the job is not working for you, the killer's hiding in the cupboard. Because if you're not careful how you design what it is that you chase after, you can spend your entire life realizing that you climbed a huge thing you did wrong.
Is there anything else?
So there is a wonderful upside in trying to conquer, and trying to achieve mastery, trying to really drive yourself to go and do stuff. But I'm not like your feelings just hustle and grind until your eyes bleed. Because one of the biggest lessons I've taken away from this year is suppression isn't the same thing as strength. And it's a good thing for guys who feel their emotions to show that they feel their emotions. Right? Like, I've been at some of my lowest points over the last 12 months. It felt like my better self was slipping through my fingers. I realized my emotions are legitimate. And denying myself that is not helping anything at all.
What happened?
那个怎么买？比如你在英国想买，
I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realise you didn't subscribe. So if you could do me a favour and double check if you're subscribed to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's a simple, it's a free thing that anybody that watches the show frequently can do to help us here, to keep everything going in the show in the trajectory it's on. So please do double check if you're subscried, and thank you so much, because in a strange way you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate that. So yeah, thank you.
卖人民币，买人民币，
My leads care a
人民币
lot
会
about
升值
changing their
的
life for the better. I think at this time of
汇
year,
率会升
change
值
is。front of mind for everybody. Everybody's thinking about New Year's resolutions, who I want to become in 2026. But when you look at the stats, 23% of people quit by the end of the first week of January. Their New Year's resolution, the thing they aimed at. Roughly half of people will quit their New Year's resolution, the change they sought, by the end of January, and only about 9% of people will keep their New Year's resolution for the full year. So I guess my opening question to you is, does this time of year matter at all? Is it a useful, productive time to be thinking about change in your point of view?
I think the world is split into 2 camps. One camp says there is no difference between January 1st and December 31st. Why wait? It's December 10th, just do it now. And the other camp likes the idea of there being a culturally appropriate moment to stop doing something and start doing something else. Most people need to realize that they're already spending tons of time worrying about the future and the past. They're going back to this thing that they regret. I wish I'd done this differently. Oh, I have rumination about something that occurred. I have a sense of wistfulness for something that I maybe missed, grief for something that I lost. Then they're concerned about the future. They think, I'm uncertain about this thing, what's going to happen, I can plan, I can try and come up with a solution for this. So you're already worrying about the past, you're already doing reflection and planning, just in a very unstructured way where you don't get to choose when it hits you in the face. This is a culturally appropriate moment, like a scheduling appropriate moment. If you just think, okay, in between Christmas and New Year, people who work in retail, God bless you, people who've got to go back to work and do that thing, but usually there's a bit of downtime. It's a little bit slower, Boxing Day, chilling out on the couch, and you're kind of thinking, wow, I was here again at mum and dad's house, or with the in-laws or whatever. What was I doing last year? What was it like last year? You're already in a little bit of a reflective mode. There is no special magic super secret squirrel sauce in January 1st. But it is a good moment to check in because life tends to slow down a little bit. Work time is a little bit more slow. And you're already doing this. You're already thinking about the past and the future, and this is just a good structured opportunity to check in.
I guess the question that everybody should be asking themselves is, what should I aim at? And is there such a thing as a two? What is a good goal for change? When you think about what you need to do, the change you've seen in your own life, what does a productive New Year's resolution look like? How do I get that?
Yeah, it's very old.